What the heck is going on? What a Wednesday it has been over the last 7-8 hours. Caitlin Clark dropping a new colorway, showing us a new colorway. This is the color of your shoe that you should have shown us the first time. I'm a fan.
3 stories dropped within 8 hours of each other on a single Wednesday. And on the surface, they looked completely unrelated. A shoe reveal, a quiet availability update from Shootaround, and a letter from Washington, D.C. that landed on the commissioner's desk. But when you line them up next to each other and look at who responded to what and how fast and what they stayed completely silent about, a very specific picture emerges about the Indiana Fever organization. Not the picture they want you to see, the one hiding just underneath it. If you've been following the Fever this season, you already know something feels off. But this particular Wednesday put it all on the table at once. So let's go through it piece by piece, because the timing here is not a coincidence, and the details matter more than the headlines. And before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who wants the full story instead of the highlight reel version, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is exactly the type of breakdown you're not going to get anywhere else. Let's start with the easy one. Caitlin Clark's new Nike Caitlin 1 yellow colorway dropped, and honestly, it looked great. Sharp, clean, distinctive. A massive upgrade over the blue and white version that drew mixed reactions when it first released. The yellow pops. It photographs well. It looks like a signature shoe is supposed to look, something you'd actually want to wear outside of basketball court.
At Caitlin Clark's new yellow colorway of the Nike Caitlin 1, these are 10 zillion times better than the blue and whites. They pop more. They look more unique. They look crispier. Much better.
The reported retail price is sitting at $140, which is a deliberate number. Comparable signature Jordan models run anywhere from $185 to over $200, depending on the colorway. Nike and the Fever's marketing team position this as accessible, aspirational, but not out of reach. Something a teenager could ask for as a birthday gift and a parent could actually say yes to. That's not accidental. That's brand strategy executed cleanly. The Fever released footage of Clark lacing up the yellow pair right before a home game against Los Angeles. A yellow shoe against LA. Make of that what you will. Marketing calendars get set months in advance, so reading too much into one game matchup is risky. But functionally, the timing of that footage release served a very specific purpose. It gave the fan base something fun, something celebratory, something to argue about in the comment section, while 2 other stories were quietly developing in the background. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how news cycles work when you have a communications team. You lead with the positive. You let the complicated stuff filter in later. The problem is when you look at what was filtering in at the same time, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Here's the part that actually matters. At Shootaround that Wednesday, it was confirmed that Aaliyah Boston would sit out against the Sparks.
Letting us all know, moving on. Aaliyah Boston will be out tonight against the Sparks, and Caitlin Clark will be available, and they'll flip-flop tomorrow for the game against Phoenix, where Boston will be available and Clark will be out. This is load management. This is what they fired Scott Agness for. In case you guys aren't aware, this is what they fired.
Caitlin Clark would be available and play. Then the next night against Phoenix, they flip. Boston plays. Clark sits. No new injury designation. No specific medical update. Just 2 franchise players alternating games on a back-to-back schedule with the kind of calm, matter-of-fact delivery you'd use to explain a weather forecast. The phrase used publicly was flip-flop. The phrase that wasn't used publicly was load management. But when your 2 most important players are alternating availability with no injury to explain it, the label writes itself regardless of what anyone at the podium calls it.
Well, yesterday, how did she feel through shoot-around, and do you have an update on her status for tonight?
Yeah, she just did some of the shooting. She's going to be out tonight, again with a back-to-back. And Caitlin a back-to-back. Caitlin's going to be active tonight. AB's not, and then they'll flip-flop tomorrow.
What key has been
They're load managing.
This is significant for a reason that goes beyond basketball strategy. Load management is not a neutral term in professional sports. It is a deeply polarizing practice with a documented history of damaging fan trust, cratering ticket sales and creating real tension between leagues, their broadcast partners, and their paying customers. The NBA lived through this painfully for years. Superstars sat out nationally televised games. Fans flew across the country to see their favorite player and showed up to find him in a tracksuit on the bench. The league eventually had to create formal player participation policies to address it because the damage to the product was becoming measurable. And now here's the WNBA in the middle of the most important growth window in its 20-something year history, walking directly into that same trap.
Load managing. I'm adamantly against load managing. Adamantly against it. Ridiculous. Either you can play or can't. This load management bullshit is soft, and I don't think it's the player's decision. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. This coach is incompetent. Yeah, I'm not. This organization landed back-to-back #1 picks and have done nothing but fail them, failed to build around them, failed to get them a coach who knows how to maximize them as a duo, and failed to keep them injury-free. Nothing but constant injuries for CC since Stephanie White became coach.
Except the WNBA is doing it with far less margin for error, at a moment when its ticket revenue, its ratings, and its cultural momentum are disproportionately built around one person's presence on the floor. There's another layer here that makes this more complicated. According to reporting that circulated earlier this season, the act of surfacing exactly this kind of player availability information is what reportedly cost Fever Beat insider Scott Agnes his position covering the team. Let that sit for a moment. The same type of rotation transparency that allegedly ended someone's media access is now being confirmed casually at a shoot-around by a head coach. The information was never the actual problem. Control over that information, and specifically who got to release it and when, was the problem. That distinction matters enormously when you start looking at how the Fever handle communication more broadly.
You don't want to buy tickets to a game not knowing if your favorite player is going to play or if the team is going to have her load manage or she's going to load manage. You don't want to do that as a fan. You don't want to do that. I've used this example numerous times. The Lakers were coming to Brooklyn to play the Nets. I was getting ready to hit purchase. This is what, 5, 6, 7 years ago. This is a long time ago. I was getting ready to hit purchase on a ticket sale. I said, you know what? Let me just make sure that none of these guys are load managing. I open up the ESPN app. I come to find out LeBron's load managing, Anthony Davis load managing. It just left a bad taste in my mouth.
Here's the most honest way to explain what load management does to a sports business. Imagine you're a fan in Phoenix. You bought tickets to tomorrow's game weeks ago. Maybe you bought them the same day they went on sale because you knew Caitlin Clark was coming to town. You told your kids. You made dinner reservations around the game schedule. You've already paid for parking. Now it's the night before the game, and you find out Clark isn't playing. You're not getting a refund. You're not getting a discount. You're getting the same seat at the same price for a product that is measurably different from what you thought you were purchasing. And the frustration that follows that moment doesn't just affect tomorrow night. It affects every purchase decision you make about this team for the rest of the season. Next time there's a game you want to attend, you check the injury report first, and a certain percentage of the people who go through that experience stop buying altogether because the uncertainty isn't worth the investment. This is not speculation. This is exactly what happened to the NBA over the course of several seasons. A sport built on individual star power found out that when fans can't trust the star will actually show up, they stop planning around him. They watch from home instead. They wait for someone else to tell them the game was worth watching before they engage. The WNBA has spent 3 seasons selling itself on a specific promise. Buy a ticket, see the stars. Clark's road games have been sellouts in arenas that weren't drawing those numbers before she arrived. Families plan around her. Casual fans convert to regular viewers because of her. The economic case for the league's current growth story runs directly through her availability. Every game she sits is a game where an arena sold out on her name delivers a diminished product to people who planned their week around a promise that quietly disappeared. You don't get to import load management culture at this stage of the league's development and expect it to be cost-free. The NBA could absorb the damage eventually because it had decades of loyalty, multi-star rosters, and enough market depth to survive a few bad ticket experiences per city. The WNBA doesn't have that cushion yet, and the Fever more than any other franchise, can afford that kind of erosion the least. Now here's where things get genuinely strange. While the shoe story and the availability report were developing, a letter from a congressional group arrived addressed to WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert.
Aware by now, I talked about this on the Quick Hits channel. Congress is asking answers from the WNBA. They're asking answers from Kathy Engelbert. They penned a letter to Kathy Engelbert, and Chloe Peterson, being the mouthpiece for the Fever, Chloe Peterson has put out a Fever statement regarding that letter. Quote, "Our organization nor Caitlin have had any interaction with anyone in this congressional group, and we were unaware."
The stated subject was player safety. The letter asked the league office for answers about how the WNBA protects its players from the physical treatment that has been documented and debated for several seasons now. That letter was addressed to the commissioner, not the Indiana Fever, not any specific team, not Caitlin Clark by name, Kathy Engelbert's office, the league office. Within hours, the Indiana Fever released a full organizational statement through their beat reporter responding to that letter. Read it again slowly. A congressional letter addressed to a league commissioner in a different building about a systemic league-wide issue prompted a rapid multi-sentence organizational statement from a team that wasn't named, referenced, or contacted in that letter. The statement said, and this is a close paraphrase, that neither the organization nor Caitlin Clark had any interaction with anyone in the congressional group and that they were unaware of the letter prior to its public reporting. It also stated that they had been clear in their public comments about player safety and that their players and fans know where the organization stands. Let's take each piece of that apart carefully, because this is where the details really matter. First, nobody asked them. The letter didn't reference the Fever. It didn't name Clark as a Fever player. It was addressed to the commissioner. So the first question that statement generates is simple. Why did you feel the need to respond at all? Second, the claim that they have been clear in their public comments about player safety is generous, to put it gently. If you go back through the documented public record of this season, what you find is approximately one instance of head coach Stephanie White expressing visible frustration in a post-game press conference. That is the public record. One press conference. Against a backdrop of 3 seasons worth of footage, commentary, and fan documentation of Clark absorbing physical treatment that drew significant attention. A position you never articulate publicly isn't a position. It's a private belief that produces zero accountability and changes nothing about the environment your player is competing in. Saying your players and fans know where you stand when the evidence of your public posture tells a very different story isn't a defense. It's a contradiction dressed up as a statement. Here is the detail that unlocks this entire news cycle. Look at what the Fever responded to this season and how fast versus what they stayed silent about, and for how long. A reported smear campaign ran in public discourse against Caitlin Clark for approximately 2 weeks. The organizational response during that window was effectively silence. Clark reportedly took a shot to the throat in a game. Visible, documented, the kind of thing that gets clipped and shared instantly. Organizational response, silence, or as close to it as makes no practical difference. Reports and speculation circulated about head coach Stephanie White's job security. Organizational response. The situation got described publicly as fake news, which is a dismissal, not an engagement. A congressional letter arrives that does not mention the Indiana Fever, does not mention Caitlin Clark as a member of the Indiana Fever, and is addressed to a commissioner at the league office. Organizational response. A polished, multi-sentence statement distributed through their beat reporter within hours. Organizations tell you who they are through their response times, not through their press releases, not through their media guides, not through their social media content, through what they move fast on and what they let sit. When something threatened the public perception of Caitlin Clark, the Fever took days or said nothing at all. When something arrived that might raise questions about organizational governance, they had a statement ready before most fans had finished reading the initial report. The host of the original discussion floated the phrase guilty conscience. Whether you want to go that far is up to you, but the asymmetry itself requires an explanation. You do not rush to respond to accusations that were never leveled at you unless something in the situation feels personally relevant. And that feeling, whatever its source, is actually the most honest piece of communication the organization produced all day. Here's the tension at the center of all of this that the Fever organization genuinely cannot resolve with its current public posture. They are simultaneously using player safety as the justification for load management, while maintaining years of public silence on the conditions that make their players' physical safety a documented conversation in the first place. You cannot say we are protecting our player from wear and tear on a back-to-back while offering essentially no sustained public advocacy for that same player when she gets physically targeted on the floor. Those two positions require each other to be coherent. You either take player safety seriously as a public organizational priority, which means you say something consistently and loudly when your player gets hit, not just when a schedule creates a convenient rest opportunity, or you admit that the decision to sit Clark on a given night is primarily about managing minutes across a long season, which is a legitimate sports science argument, but not a player safety argument. The Fever want the moral framing of player safety without the public accountability that framing requires. And their fan base, including some of the most loyal Clark supporters in the country, is starting to notice the gap. What makes this particularly sharp is the back-to-back #1 draft picks piece. The Fever have built a franchise around generational talent. 2 consecutive #1 overall selections. That is a level of advantage in roster construction that most franchises never experience once, let alone twice. And the fan base's read on what has been built around that advantage is not flattering. The criticism isn't coming from people looking for reasons to be negative. It's coming from people who bought in completely and are now watching the results not match the potential, and specifically watching an organizational communication style that seems more invested in managing their own image than in publicly fighting for the player whose presence made their brand relevant nationally. Step back from the Fever specifically for a moment and look at the bigger picture, because there's a league-wide dimension here that the WNBA's office will eventually have to address directly. The league is currently riding a wave of momentum that is historically unprecedented for women's professional basketball in North America. Ratings are breaking records. Expansion teams are selling out before they've played a single game. Media rights deals that would have been unimaginable 5 years ago are now the floor of the conversation rather than the ceiling. New corporate sponsors are arriving at a pace that reflects genuine business interest rather than token support. Nearly all of that momentum has a single gravitational center. One player whose presence in a market moves tickets, moves ratings, moves media attention, and moves casual sports fans from passive awareness to active engagement. That is not a criticism of anyone else in the league. It is simply an accurate description of how sports media markets work around transcendent individual talents. Load management applied to that player is not a neutral scheduling decision in that context. It is a direct reduction in the value of the product that the league is selling at the exact moment when it needs that product to be as compelling as possible to lock in new audiences who are still making up their minds about whether women's basketball is worth their consistent attention. The NBA created formal policies around this problem because it reached a point where the league's broadcast partners were explicitly complaining about paying for nationally televised games that featured stars resting on the bench in street clothes. The WNBA's broadcast partners, who signed on largely because of the story that Clark's presence makes possible, are not going to be immune to the same frustration if the league's marquee player becomes synonymous with availability uncertainty. And there's one more dimension that connects back to that congressional letter. When elected officials take enough interest in a sports league's treatment of its athletes to put concerns in writing to the commissioner, that is a signal. It does not matter whether the letter generates policy changes or disappears into a file cabinet. The fact of it existing tells you that the conversation around player safety in the WNBA has crossed from sports discourse into a wider public conversation that now involves institutional stakeholders outside of basketball. That is a different kind of problem than a bad news cycle. That is the beginning of a governance question that leagues historically address slowly and then all at once when the pressure becomes impossible to manage. Here is the part of this conversation that tends to get lost when people focus on any single incident. 3 years. That is roughly how long the documented public conversation about how Caitlin Clark is treated physically on the floor has been running. 3 years of footage, 3 years of fan reaction, 3 years of media debate, 3 years of the argument cycling through the same points about physicality and physicality's place in women's basketball. And across those 3 years, the Fever's public posture on the issue has produced approximately one memorable moment of a head coach sounding frustrated in a press conference. 3 years is long enough to build a reputation. The reputation the Fever have built is one of an organization that processes these incidents internally, says as little as possible publicly, and moves on without creating any sustained accountability for how their most important player is treated on the floor. Compare that to how quickly they moved on a letter that never mentioned their name, and you have the complete picture of what this organization's actual communication priorities are. To be clear, load management as a practice in sports science terms is not inherently indefensible. Bodies break down. Soft tissue injuries spike on back-to-back schedules. Clark has already missed significant time this season, and managing her minutes intelligently across a long year is not an unreasonable thing for a medical staff to recommend. That is real. That is legitimate. The problem is the packaging. When your organizational communication around player safety is essentially limited to resting your player on a given night while staying publicly silent about the conditions that make protecting her body a pressing concern in the first place. You're treating a symptom while publicly declining to acknowledge the disease. That's not a player's safety strategy. That is a scheduling decision that borrows the language of care to avoid the harder conversation. At the end of a day that featured a shoe launch, a rotation announcement, and an unsolicited congressional response, one question sits at the center of everything. Does the Indiana Fever organization exist to protect Caitlin Clark, or does it exist to protect itself from the complications that Caitlin Clark's situation creates? Because those are genuinely two different jobs. An organization that exists to protect its players shows up publicly when she gets targeted consistently, repeatedly, and without needing to be prompted by a letter from Washington. An organization that exists to protect itself from her situation manages the optics as carefully as possible, responds quickly when its governance might be questioned, and stays quiet when the issue is someone else's conduct toward the player. The evidence of this particular Wednesday, when you lay all 3 stories side by side and look at the response patterns, points in one direction. And the fan base, including the most devoted Clark supporters, is doing the same math and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. This is the kind of moment that tends to define how organizations are remembered long after the season ends. Not the wins and losses, not the shoe deals. The moments when the gap between what an organization says and what it does becomes visible to everyone watching. The Fever statement says their players and fans know where they stand. Based on everything this single Wednesday put on display, the fans know exactly where the organization stands, just not in the way that statement was intended. So here's where I'm leaving this with you. Is load managing Caitlin Clark a responsible, data-driven decision by a medical and coaching staff trying to protect the most valuable player in the league? Or is it an organization managing optics and minutes after 3 years of publicly failing to defend her from the conditions that make protecting her body a weekly conversation in the first place? You cannot fully believe both versions at the same time. Pick one and drop your answer in the comments below. I want to see where you all land on this, because the split on that question tells you everything about where this fan base's trust actually sits right now. If this breakdown gave you something the surface level coverage isn't going to give you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find this conversation. And subscribe if you want to be here when the league finally has to give a real answer to that congressional letter, because that response, whenever it comes, is going to be worth watching very closely. See you in the next one.